Happy Monday. All right. Welcome to the broadcast. I'm ECM, Elizabeth Cronise McLaughlin. Many of you know that already. Welcome to our new followers and subscribers. I'm really happy to see you here. We have a ton of stuff to cover today, particularly with regard to gag orders and testimony and the like. But before we do that, as always, I'm coming to you from occupied Tongva land here in Southern California. And for our visually challenged viewers today, I am wearing a black ribbed long sleeve sweater. My hair is pulled back in a high ponytail. I am a pink skinned, green eyed, dirty blonde woman. And today I've got on a new red lipstick that I got over the weekend. Well, it's looking kind of pink on the camera, actually, but it's red. It's supposed to be red. And I'm sitting in my office, as always, with a big green leafy plant behind me and a floor lamp and my big cushy chair and my bookcase. And it's cold here this morning. Again, we have kind of like the Santa Ana wind thing going on here. Anyway, my pronouns are she, her. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. Okay, so let's talk first and foremost. While I say hello to everybody. Wow, like again, we've got a ton of people here from all over the world. It's great. I want to talk about Judge Chutkan's order. So those of you who were here on Friday, and particularly our Patreon subscribers who were here yesterday for Progressive Coffee Hour, know that I had been predicting that Chutkan was going to reinstate the gag order and lift the administrative stay probably by Monday. And I was not wrong. Late last night, she reinstated the gag order and issued a written opinion as to why she was doing it. The written opinion was actually not available until early this morning, but the minute order was on the record, the docket rather, of the District Court for the District of Columbia late last night. And so this is really good news. Now, I want to say one thing about this. Trump went off on Bill Barr about 90 minutes after this order came down. And Bill Barr is expected to be a potential witness in the case that Jack Smith is bringing in D.C. The question now becomes, what happens next? So Judge Chutkan actually added a little bit of color to this in her order last night about how she was going to consider all of this. And she did it in the context of talking about the argument that Trump's attorneys made that the gag order was vague. Vagueness is actually a doctrine. It's not just a word. It's actually a legal doctrine that relates to things like interpretation of statutes, interpretation of orders, constitutionality. And so there was a debate in the briefs that were filed about whether or not the order was unduly vague. And I'll remind everyone that the whole context for this was the idea that somehow Trump's First Amendment rights were being, violated because of this gag order. And I've said from the very beginning, there's no question that they weren't, and that the argument was specious. But here we are. So in the context of talking about the fact that her initial order was not unconstitutionally vague, one of the things that she said was that going forward, in the event that there was a violation, she was going to consider every violation in its own context. And this is important because this is what I would expect from her anyway. There's a deep specificity that's required to the analysis of this, as I've pointed out many, many times, to ensure that the boundaries of First Amendment protections are held. And simultaneously, that threats against witnesses and, court staff and prosecutors and the jury pool are taken very, very seriously. So she, in the section about vagueness, she does have a couple of sentences in there where she says, essentially, in the event that there's a violation, I'm going to consider everything piece by piece. That doesn't make the order unconstitutionally vague. What it means essentially is that every single violation has to be taken on its own, all right, or potential violation. And indeed, she gave two examples in the order of this, which are really relevant. One, which was a statement he made on Truth Social about Biden and, the idea that this was all election interference and this was a prosecution by Biden and blah, 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 which she said does not violate her gag order. All right. And then she pointed to a series of statements that he made about Mark Meadows while the gag order was administratively stayed. You will remember that I pointed these out last week also. And she said if he had made these statements while the gag order had been in place, these statements are examples of what would have violated the gag order. So she's given an awful lot of guidance here to Trump and his people about what violates this gag order and what doesn't. And I'm just going to point out, he seems entirely incapable of controlling himself. And, that is a choice. And I don't think it's going to end well for him going forward if he continues to do things like what he did against Mark Meadows. He's out again today making comments about the unconstitutionality of this order. That doesn't violate the order, but he has not yet attacked a witness or the prosecutors again. So again, we'll have to wait and see what happens next. All right. So that's that. And it's good news. I mean, I have to point out, again, we've got another situation looming here in New York because he went off on Judge Engoron over the weekend. And while Judge Engoron is not explicitly contained in that gag order, he is technically falls within the purview of like court staff, which is something that is contained in the gag order. So we have a lot of different moving pieces here on now dueling. They're not even dueling. They're just like consistent, consistent gag orders, but in two separate cases related to two separate courtrooms and two separate proceedings. So again, walls are closing in. I knew this gag order was going to be reinstated because there wasn't really any way that it wouldn't be after what he said about Mark Meadows. And, here we are. Now we will wait and see what happens next. All right. Also, very big upcoming, actually, there's two very big legal developments this week. Let's talk about the first one first. The Colorado case seeking to ban Trump or bar Trump from being on the Colorado ballot in 2024 is beginning this morning. And even over the weekend, there was like yet another attempt by Trump's legal team to toss this thing, and every single one of them has been denied. So this morning, a hearing is beginning on whether or not there is a basis to keep Trump off the ballot. Now, I'm going to freely reiterate to everyone that I think this is a long shot. I've said something similar previously on the broadcast many, many times. And I also just want to point out here that, one of the things that we have to consider here is the precedential authority of a case like this vis-a-vis, for instance, the case that has been filed in Minnesota that follows the same line of argument. Again, we're going to have to see how this plays out. I do think it's going to end up in front of the Supreme Court. Again, really interesting questions of law at issue here. But if Trump's not on the ballot, then what? So this was a question that was asked this morning over on the Patreon feed. I'm going to remind you that if you're not yet a paid Patreon subscriber, you can get on over there. And for as little as $2 a month, we have subscriptions running all the way up to 100. You can ask questions for 2 hours in advance of this broadcast. And as long as I have the time and they're not unduly duplicative, I'm going to answer them. Okay. So you can get on over there at patreon.com/resistance live if you have questions that aren't being answered by anybody else. All right. So the way that this works, this will work in Colorado, is that if his name is not on the ballot, of course, there is an opportunity to write him in. However, as I mentioned on a broadcast last week, this idea of writing people in has sort of already been gamed out. And the prediction is that roughly 30% of his followers, who I'm going to remind you, like the hardcore Trumpers really only make up 20% of this country. We really need higher voter turnout this time around. Like, it's more important than it's ever been. All right. But they may write in his name. 30% of 20%, even if it's 30% of 50%, is not enough people to win an election. All right. As for the Electoral College, whoever wins the vote is going to get the electoral votes in that state. That's how it works. All right. So presumably, and this is why the slate of fraudulent electors were what they were. Okay. So if he's not on the ballot and he doesn't win by write-in, then he doesn't get the electoral votes, just like anybody else who loses. All right. So at this stage of the game, I'm really very interested to see how this plays out from a legal standpoint. I'm going to remind everybody that we had sort of like a test run of this before an elections board in Georgia about Marjorie Taylor Greene in 2022, which she won. But that's a very different situation from where we are now, where it's like a courtroom. I mean, you all remember there was testimony in front of the elections board at that point. But I'm very curious to see how this plays out, because this is a much higher scale, higher stakes kind of a matter. So eyes on that one this week as well. That starts today. Okay. Other big legal development this week is that Don Jr., Eric Trump, and Ivanka are all going to have to testify this week in New York State. And they are being called as a part of Tish James's case in chief, which means like her initial presentation of evidence in the civil fraud case against Donald Trump. Lots of questions about how they're going to testify. I'm going to remind everybody, Don Jr. and Eric are defendants. Ivanka was dismissed from the case as a defendant due to the statute of limitations because she left the Trump organization when she went to work in the White House. Lots of questions about how this is going to play out. And my anticipation, of course, is that these are going to be hostile witnesses. That means, as we have discussed previously, that they do not have to be asked open-ended questions on direct once they are designated as hostile. Leading questions can be asked of them once they are designated as hostile by Judge Engoron. Let me give an example of this, all right, just so you all know what to expect here. In direct examination, you're not allowed to ask leading questions where basically you as the lawyer are stating the evidence and asking for a yes or no, all right? So a direct examination question might be something like, please describe what happened when you were asked to review the 2016 financial statement for the Trump organization. Please describe your process in reviewing the validity of the information that was described there, okay? That's an open-ended question, all right? A cross-examination question or a question of a hostile witness goes something like this. Isn't it true that you were simply told the number that Donald Trump wanted the net worth of the Trump organization to come out at, and everything was reverse engineered in those financial statements to reach that answer, yes or no? That's a leading question, okay? And so my expectation is that we're going to see the kids designated as hostile witnesses, all right? Now, there was a question about the Fifth Amendment, and this is going to be really interesting to see how this plays out because I think this is going to be very different depending on each kid. All right. So Don Jr. and Eric are defendants. Okay. But this is a civil case. I got to remind everybody, it's not a criminal case. All right. However, anything that they say can be used against them, right? So there may be a possibility that they may take the fifth on certain questions that are asked here if they think it's going to open them up to criminal liability. And I don't want anybody to be shocked if that happens. The Fifth Amendment exists for very good reasons. You have a fundamental constitutional right against self-incrimination. And, again, before anybody loses their minds about this, taking the Fifth Amendment or the existence of the Fifth Amendment exists to protect the constitutional rights of everyone. It is the reason why if you are arrested and you invoke your right to counsel, you don't have to actually tell the cops anything, right? It's the reason why when you are read your Miranda rights, you are told you have the right to remain silent, okay? So nobody should lose their mind over this, all right? There's very, very clear and concise reasons as to why someone might take the Fifth Amendment. However, in civil court, there are presumptions that can be attached in the event that the person chooses not to testify. This is not the case in criminal court, all right? So if you take the Fifth Amendment and you happen to be a defendant in that matter, as is Don Jr. or Eric, there can be a presumption applied by the judge, either in jury instructions or in their own evaluation of the evidence, as this judge is deciding this case, there's no jury, that what the individual would have testified to would have self-incriminated, all right? So it's a different story in civil court than it is in criminal court, and it's also going to differ depending on the child here, because Ivanka's not a defendant any longer, all right? So again, very, very critical here to remember that, how this is responded, how this is dealt with from a Fifth Amendment perspective, it depends on whether it's a criminal or a civil context, and it also depends on these individual kids. Now, Amy, I see your comment here about them being adults, not kids. Yes, I know they're all grown adults. I'm not attributing to them some form of infantilization. They are simply the children of Donald Trump. That's the reason why I'm describing it that way. All right. Nonetheless, the very interesting thing here is going to be to see how they are dealt with as witnesses being called by Tish James. And there's more coming on this, so just hold on a second. How they're dealt with by Tish James as a part of the presentation of her evidence, her case in chief against all of the defendants. All right, now hold up, because it's not just the children. She's also going to call Donald Trump. And we learned this morning that his testimony date is now November 6th. So I think that's a week from today. We are going to see the former president of the United States called to the witness stand by Tish James. Oof. Actually, I think it's a week from tomorrow. That's going to be a ride. And of course, I'll be here the whole time. asking, and answering rather all the questions that you all have to ask about what's happening on regular speed. And, I'm really curious as to how that one's going to go. All right. Because I have said repeatedly here over the last almost 7 years that there's not a snowball's chance in hell that if Donald Trump was my client, not that he ever would be, I would ever put him on a witness stand, because he's completely uncontrollable. Even if he's coached in advance, he's going to say something that's like not okay. And personally, I just really think that we're in for a really wild ride in the New York State fraud case over the next, let's call it 10 days or so. So stay tuned, and don't forget that, again, this case is not televised, but there are reporters in the courtroom, including folks like Adam Klasfeld, who are like live streaming this on Threads as it's happening. And I think also on X, but I'm not sure. I'm not ever over there anymore. And I do want people to understand that if like you have questions about this, like that's the whole reason why I'm here. So you should like head on over to patreon.com/resistance-live and like get in on your dime a day paid subscription to ask me questions if you would care to do that. All right. Okay, so that's that. Now, I did have another question that was asked on the Patreon feed, which was really interesting this morning, about the nature of family members testifying against one another. And so I do want to make one thing clear here. There are two instances in which spouses cannot be permitted, or actually like don't have to, is really the way to put it, testify against one another or against another spouse. All right. So you're not going to see Melania called to the stand here. Not that Melania has any idea what happened inside the Trump organization with these financial statements. I don't think she cares one whit about any of this, especially now that she's renegotiated her prenup 3 times. So one of the things that folks should be aware of, though, is that it's not every family member. It's only spouses. And there are 2 forms of spousal privilege in New York State. Reminder, I am like a New York lawyer, so this is all kind of like deeply embedded in me. There are evidentiary protections under the rules of evidence of New York State. And this is true, by the way, in most states around the country, although it varies a little bit from state to state. Spouses cannot, in civil matters, be forced to testify against their spouse unless the spouse consents. Okay. And that evidence is not admissible unless there is consent from the other spouse against it. And that, for instance, would be like, let's just say hypothetically in a divorce proceeding, you're divorcing your spouse and like there's a debate over marital property or like who owns what. If you're not in a, state where it's automatically split 50-50, that might be a situation in which you consent to have the other person testify about marital communications. All right. But in a criminal matter, a spouse cannot be forced to testify against another spouse about conversations or anything else that they know about that came through marital communications. All right. So again, like all of this is Klasfeld, Klasfeld, Adam Klasfeld, Sherry. He writes for a blog called The Messenger. I will just tell you that I think that it's important for people to understand this when you're wondering why, let's just say hypothetically, Melania will not be called to testify. She can't be, the evidence is not admissible, okay? And she can't be forced to testify. So there is still a marital privilege that exists both from an evidentiary standpoint and a criminal standpoint. The standards are slightly different for both of those. The details of that are not relevant to today's conversation. But I do want you all to understand that the children testifying is not an issue. All right. The children are testifying. Again, I'll just reiterate this. Don Jr. and Eric Trump are co-defendants in the civil fraud case. Ivanka was a co-defendant until she was dismissed on statute of limitations grounds. All 3 of them held executive positions inside the Trump organization. Okay. So they're being called to testify by Tish James because they have evidence relevant to whether or not A, they committed fraud, and B, whether or not other people who are co-defendants and the organization itself committed fraud, insurance fraud, banking fraud, all sorts of other allegations are made, right? Like filing of false documents. All of that is relevant. Okay. Okie dokie. So, I think that's it for New York. All right. So other questions that came up this morning. I want to talk just for a second. I want to reiterate to everyone about Mike Johnson's speakership. So if you did not watch the broadcast on Friday, I just want to remind everybody of something here that is like insanely relevant to where we find ourselves so that no one panics. Okay, please. All right. It is incredibly important that we take back the House in 2024. But if we take back the House in 2024, Mike Johnson is not going to have any say whatsoever over the election results in any way, shape, or form. All right. the new House of Representatives, based on the 2024 election results in the House, are going to be sat on the 3rd of January of 2025. The election results for president are going to be ruled upon, like, it's really just an administrative process. That's the way it always was until January 6th of 2021. On January 6th of 2025, Kamala Harris will be overseeing that process because she will be the vice president still. Because assuming that even if Biden doesn't get reelected, the new president doesn't get sat until the 20th of January of 2025. So, everybody kind of needs to just chill out about this. All right. And I have to remind everybody that the role of Speaker of the House does not control whether or not bills become law, does not control what happens in the Senate, does not control the veto power of the presidency, none of it. All right. So the House is going to do a lot of crazy stuff under Mike Johnson, and everybody should be aware of that. All right. It's going to be scary. It's going to be sort of real indication of Christo-fascism and how it would work in America if they had both the houses of Congress and the presidency. Let it be a warning to you of the reason why it's wildly important that you get involved in getting out the vote and canvassing and text banking and phone banking and working at the local level and not just at the federal level on all election-related issues for 2024. All right? But his level of authority is not such that he's going to be able to get much done. All right. And, for those who are like, can Schumer stop these bills? Well, yes, of course. Right. I mean, and it's not just Schumer. It's like the Senate, which is a whole separate body currently under the control of the Democrats. And, reminder for those of you who missed Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill and I'm only a bill and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Any bill has to get through both houses of Congress and be signed by the president before it becomes law. So we're not going to have a national abortion ban under Mike Johnson, unless, of course, we don't do the work of taking back the House in 2024 and getting Joe Biden reelected and expanding our lead in the Senate, or at least holding it. Okay. So I hope everybody understands now why I come on here and I say to all of you that it's not enough to just engage with what's happening from a news cycle level. Democracy is a participatory thing and you've got to get involved. You have to get involved. And I mean that not just at the campaign level or the issue level. I mean it in the context of every single conversation you have where you live. Every single moment that you interact with anyone in your own area is an opportunity to engage in deep canvassing strategies. We talked about this a lot here. You can all go watch my How We Win in 2024 video, which is pinned to the top of this YouTube channel. Go check it out. All right. Okay. Pence has dropped out of the 2024 race. This will come as no surprise to anyone who saw the footage of him talking to 7 really bored looking senior citizens in a shoe store last week. So he's no longer in the running. We do have 4 candidates who have qualified for the third Republican debate. They are Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley, and Chris Christie. So that's going to be the next debate. All right. I'm just going to tell everybody, without making any sort of predictions here, I would pay very close attention to Nikki Haley going forward. And I will tell you why. Because I think that if Trump is incarcerated in advance of the RNC picking a nominee, she at this moment is probably the most likely substitute. She is not any better. I have to remind everybody, she is not any better. She's not any better. None of these people are any better. Okay. And I think that we've got to start anticipating, because, we like to kind of pay attention in advance to these things. We've got to start anticipating what our work is going to look like in the event that Trump is not the nominee. All right. It's going to be a much different race for presidency if somebody like Nikki Haley ends up as the nominee than it will be if it's Trump. All right. Our talking points are going to have to be a bit different because she looks again, this is like a Trojan horse situation, right? She looks like a much more reasonable Republican, even though she's not. Okay. So it's really important that we are focused also on the big picture, and we're starting to think about the long game here. We've got a little more than a little more than a year, a few days more than a year right now between now and the 2024 election. All right. That brings me to the next question. Lots of people are pointing out that Trump has had, lots of people on the Patreon feed are pointing out, because the mainstream media isn't doing this, that Trump has had a number of really quite noticeable gaffes isn't the right word, like mental glitches, I think is probably the better way to put it, over the last few days on the campaign trail. He did not know what city he was in Iowa, and had to be reminded by a staffer on the side of the stage where he was. He has not been able to string full sentences together in many of these speeches that he's given. The stump speech is not rote for him, and there have been a lot of errors that seem to indicate like increasing mental decline. I am personally, and I've said this many times on threads over the last week, really bothered by the fact that the mainstream media spent basically the entire summer of 2023 talking about whether or not Biden was too old to run again, and they're not giving any time to the discussion of the fact that Trump's mental decline is rapid and really obvious, like really obvious. And my hope is that we're going to see some additional mainstream media coverage of this pick up. Now, over on the Patreon feed this morning, somebody said, what happens if like he has a medical event after he's the nominee? And I just have to say, I don't think anybody knows. Like, again, I have to point out to everyone, like, we are in really unprecedented times here. Okay. The kind of circumstances that we're living through on a daily basis, like a presidential candidate, former president who's been indicted 91 times in 4 separate jurisdictions, being the front runner of a given party, never heard of in American history. Nobody knows how it's going to work if he actually gets convicted and goes to prison. Nobody has any idea, right? So, you know, again, I assume that the Republican National Committee is going to put up another candidate or not, right? Like, that's the other thing is like, they're so all in on Trump, they may just decide to run him from like the clink. So it's kind of anybody's guess. And I personally will just remind everyone that like, not everything can be gamed out. And, you know, I personally think there's a very strong likelihood that he's going to be in prison before November of 2024. I know there are other people who disagree with me, who think he's going to serve time with an ankle bracelet in Mar-a-Lago. I will be very surprised if that's how things work out, particularly in Fulton County. But again, nobody knows. And, you know, that's part of the ride here is that, like, I know everyone's trying to manage their anxiety about this, but I don't really think anybody can make a prediction about what's going to happen if that ends up being the case, or for that matter, if he has a medical event. Because God knows they're trying to cover up his like obvious instability at the moment. So that will be that. And, you know, again, I just, I have to remind everyone that we'll see how this plays out as it plays out, but it also doesn't serve you in terms of your own work to preserve democracy and everything else, to be spending time spinning out worst case scenarios, you know, and what might happen there. So speaking of that, I'm just going to mention as well, someone on the Patreon feed this morning said that they were very concerned about another quote unquote uprising in the event that Trump is sent to prison. Okay, I'm not. And I'm going to tell you why. All right. I think one of the things that happened after January 6th, and particularly after the prosecution and incarceration of more than 1,000 people who were at the Capitol. And by the way, those prosecutions are ongoing. There's a sentencing this morning where the prosecution has asked for 10 years against someone who like beat up police officers on the Hill on January 6th. I want to remind everyone that one of the things that has happened on the far right is that because they are watching people being prosecuted and sent to prison, that kind of organized uprising is not the right word. I mean, like, the George Floyd uprising deserves the title uprising. It was an insurrection. All right. The idea that there's going to be some mass event of violence again is less likely now than it was in 2020 and 2021. Okay. Part of that is because the far right has moved away from that as an organizing strategy. Part of that is because there's been an enormous amount of deterrence as a result of these prosecutions and incarcerations against regular everyday folks, quote unquote, like, you know, white supremacist, regular everyday folks getting involved in something like that. However, there may be incidents of threats and incidents of lone wolf violence. We spent a lot of time on this broadcast talking about that as well. You know, like Trump makes a statement about Judge Chutkan and somebody gets arrested in Texas for calling her chambers and threatening to murder her. All right. Like that sort of thing we may see. Do I think there's going to be some kind of like mass, you know, people with AR-15s marching in every city trying to kill people because Trump went to prison? No, I don't. And I also will just say this, by the way, I think law enforcement is far better prepared right now in the event that he does end up in prison than they would be otherwise. I'm going to remind everyone that for weeks before the indictments dropped in Fulton County, they had barriers up around the courthouse. Fani Willis warned the entire courthouse staff that, you know, her staff was not going to be working on site at the end of July and in early August. She asked them to remove any trials that were ongoing from the docket during that window of time in case there was violence. That she briefed the sheriff's office for Fulton County, Georgia, like repeatedly to make sure that they were prepared for anything that was going to happen. And lo and behold, it was nothing, but they were ready. They were ready. And that's the important part. Okay. So I don't think anyone should spend their time worrying about this. All right. And I'm going to just point out, by the way, you know, we have lone wolf white supremacist violence all over the country right now. It's not like it's not happening every day. Okay. I personally just want everyone to understand that I think that there is a serious understanding in federal and state law enforcement right now of the possibility of something like that. And also, I would just sort of like rest assured, and I want, this guy's getting blocked. Bye. I want people to like rest assured that I'm certain that the FBI and state law enforcement are doing their jobs to keep an eye on all of this and to make sure that there is, you know, an adequate response. Joanna, people sometimes complain that I'm loud here. That's what the volume button on your computer is for. I'm on a very high quality mic that was donated by a wonderful supporter of this broadcast. And if I'm a little too loud today, you can turn me down. That's what it's there for. Okay. So I also just want to mention as well here that, you know, we have various instances that are happening around the country, as I just said, involving white supremacist violence. And you know, I have to point out right now that white supremacist violence is also now including violence against Jewish people, violence against brown people, violence against Muslims, and all of this is connected. Okay, so I do want to just reiterate today, because I've said this quite frequently here on the last few weeks of broadcasts, that there is a really important thing to notice here about the way in which all of this is developing. And that is to constantly be asking yourself the question of like, who benefits from this? All right. Because if we have conduct against Jewish Americans, if we have conduct against Muslim Americans or brown Americans who are perceived to be Muslim, even if they're not, one of the things that results from that is that people like Don Jr., and this happened over the weekend, get to swoop in on mainstream news platforms and say, maybe everyone realizes now how important it is to have a strong presidential candidate. I have to remind everyone that the only thing that happens when there is division and violence interpersonally among Americans is that white Christo-fascism wins. Okay. And so I just have to keep saying it over and over again here, that we have to be able to hold room right now for nuance and big picture understanding of how international events are impacting what's happening here in the United States. Because, you know, I'm going to tell you, like, folks like Mike Johnson, folks like Donald Trump, folks like other leaders who are really, really aligned with far-right Christo-fascist movements, you know, want nothing more than for regular Americans to be killing each other over identity or perceived identity so that they have an excuse to claim that, like, I am the only one who can fix it. And I just really want everyone here to be very mindful of the fact that we have to, you know, understand that any form of division here is going to be exploited. All right. And I have to point out in this regard, you know, there's a situation that happened in Dagestan, which is a province of Russia, over the weekend, which has been, you know, there's video of it. It's been cited in many places, and lots of people, Jewish friends that I'm familiar with, Jewish people in my own family, have been rightfully terrified by looking at that footage. All right. But I have to point something out about this, because there's a lot about this particular scenario that is really raising questions. Okay. How, for instance, a mob of people carrying Palestinian flags stormed an airport en masse and targeted a single flight out of Tel Aviv. It's weird. Like, I just have to say this is a really weird scenario. All right. And I know that Dagestan is a predominantly Muslim area in Russia. It's still really strange. And the Russian officials did not seem to do anything about it in the initial moments in which it happened. Okay. And now Russian officials are claiming that the whole thing was created by Ukraine provocateurs. All right. And so I have to just remind everyone that it's very important here to be thoughtful when you are seeing things that are happening on the international stage or domestically, and ask yourself who benefits. All right, who benefits from this? Because I don't know for sure. There's developing evidence about the situation in Dagestan that's raising some really big questions about whether or not it could potentially have been a staged event. And I mean a staged event by like Putin and his people. Again, I have to point out that, like, you say one adverse word against Putin and you go to like a prison labor camp for like 8 years in Russia. But this event seemed to be allowed to kind of go off whole hog. I don't know. I mean, for me, it's raised really serious questions, and that this is not, please do not mistake me, to diminish the anti-Semitic violence and anti-Semitic threats that are happening all over the place right now. But this event looks to me to be like a little weird. Okay. I also have to point out that these threats at Cornell, that, some of you may have heard about this, that on their chats inside the Cornell community that appear to be threats against Jewish students. Again, there are folks who are calling out the fact that it looks as though this may be the effort of hackers. So I have to ask you like repeatedly, I have to ask you, I don't understand what's happening. Okay. I'm leaving this comment like alone right now. Sometimes you guys are you guys are interesting sometimes, because you have called people in the broadcast, like the last 2 episodes, trolls, who are people who I know are here all the time who are not trolls. So just be like a little mindful here. Okay. Like, the fact that somebody says something that you disagree with doesn't make them a troll. And I've got my eyes on this. And if I block people, they won't be back. All right. So in any event, I want people to just like keep an eye here on the issue of where we are on watching what's developing on the international stage and making sure that there are filters up in your own perception of what's going on. Ask yourself, when you are seeing something that maybe doesn't look a little bit right, who might be behind it? And I'm not asking you to be a conspiracy theorist, because there is a lot of overt anti-Semitism and Islamophobia happening inside the United States and elsewhere right now. But also ask yourself, like, who's going to benefit from this? Who benefits from this? Who benefits? And, I want people to be really, really mindful of that in the way that you're looking at things that you're seeing online. Like, we've talked so much here about the importance of having a solid media filter in everything that you do. All right. That goes for everything, okay, that you're seeing online. All right. Okay. Okay. What else? Bill Barr. So I mentioned already that Trump had gone after Bill Barr within 90 minutes of the Chutkan gag order being reinstated. Yes, I know. I blocked him, Cheryl. I got him. I went back and looked. Thank you for telling me. Okay. I want everyone to just be aware of the fact that we do not yet know whether or not those comments violated the gag order. However, somebody asked a question about, like, why would Bill Barr be out here making all of these like statements about Donald Trump? Okay, so many of you know that the first place that I was licensed to practice law was in Washington, D.C. And I argued my first federal court argument in the Eastern District of Virginia in front of Judge Ellis, who was the judge in charge of Paul Manafort's trial in the Eastern District of Virginia, because there was also one in D.C. Bill Barr is a Northern Virginia conservative lawyer, and he also is an ideologue. He also is someone who operates in an extreme degree of self-interest. And you may remember that after he quit the Trump administration, after the election, but before January 6th, there was some speculation about the fact that he might not be reemployable because of everything that he had done in relation to the Mueller report and everything else. And so when you see what Bill Barr is doing, okay, when you see him out on these news shows claiming that Trump is a criminal and now saying all these things after the fact that seem to indicate that, he's now against Donald Trump, I want to remind you all that he was one of the most complicit actors inside that administration during the period that he was the attorney general. Okay, first and foremost. And second of all, he knows what blowback looks like. Okay. And his version of a conservative Washington, D.C. lawyer is very familiar to me. Okay. These are folks who go to work for Republican administrations. They do all sorts of awful things. And then they come out and they have to rehabilitate their images in order to be reemployable. Every single thing that Bill Barr says in that regard should be perceived through a lens of his own self-protection. Okay. And I don't think he's doing it for any reason other than that. He's not suddenly had a come to Jesus moment. Okay. He's not suddenly had a moment where like all of the sudden, you know, he realizes that what he did was wrong. He's not apologizing for anything that he did inside the administration. He's not apologizing for allowing the family separation policy to continue. He's not apologizing for sabotaging the Mueller report before it was released to the public. He's not apologizing for any of that. He's out there saving his own ass. And that's really the only lens through which anybody should be seeing it. All right. Okay. Voting maps in Georgia were tossed out on Friday. And I touched upon this a little bit over the weekend and, you know, on Threads, and we discussed it a little bit yesterday on Coffee Hour. I think all of it kind of is blurring together a little bit for me right now. But I do want to point out that a judge, hold on a second, because this is relevant. A judge in the Northern District of Georgia tossed out the Georgia redistricting maps. And the Georgia redistricting maps also, by the way, no surprise, were racially gerrymandered. One of the things that is the most egregious about the racial gerrymandering is that 2 predominantly Black areas were redistricted into Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. Like, you can't make this up, right? So the judge who tossed this out may be familiar to some of you. His name is Judge Jones. This is the same judge who denied Mark Meadows' removal petition in the Northern District of Georgia. It's the same one who has been hearing John Eastman's removal petition and the removal petitions of the fraudulent electors who claimed they were federal employees. Same judge, okay? Tossed out these maps. And I'm going to remind everyone that one of the things that I think is really critical to remember here is that we already have Supreme Court authority out of this Supreme Court against racial gerrymandering in Alabama. We now have a situation that's happening in Louisiana related to this. And now we have Georgia. All right. And leaving other things aside, sorry, I'm like, my throat is really scratchy. Leaving other things aside, one of the things that I want to point out here is that we have at least had positive rulings out of the Supreme Court on racial gerrymandering from May onwards. Like Alabama tried its luck twice and got rebuffed twice. And so now they have a new second predominantly Black district in Alabama that didn't exist, and that the Alabama state legislature tried to remove or eliminate or not put into place even after the Supreme Court ordered them to. All right. So my bad. Mississippi, my bad. Sorry, Mississippi. And you know, we talked last week about what was happening in North Carolina with the gerrymandering that was designed to create 3 or 4 new Republican seats, which is now being challenged in federal court. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of focus on the issue of racial gerrymandering in the federal courts between now and, like, let's call it the spring. And these cases are going to be fast tracked because of the importance of the election. So I want everybody to be aware that this is a very positive development. I'm not actually expecting that it's going to get blowback from the Supreme Court. My expectation here is that Georgia is going to be redistricted for the better. And I think that this is like a really positive development on this front. All right. Yes, I have to remind everybody, I have 742 people watching live on my number. If you have not yet hit the like button on this broadcast, could you do that for me, please? Just like if you're on your phone, you can minimize the chat and hit that like button and hit subscribe and come right on back. Thank you for that. It helps with, like, you know, getting all this good information out to people and to new followers. All right. Final thing that I wanted to talk about today. Okay. So I have to remind everybody, polls cannot be trusted. I mean, I feel like I have to say this over and over again because reminder, the way that most polls are still conducted to this day is by landline at the dinner hour. Okay. I want to ask you who you know, who is, like, you know, in the voting electorate, who has a landline. It's like largely senior citizens, right? Like, and not just like 65-year-old senior citizens. Like, my dad is 82 and he doesn't have a landline. So think about that. Think about, like, who's actually answering the phone at the dinner hour. Okay. It's not people with young kids. It's not people of my generation, right? Like, who's actually answering a landline anyway? That's the way most polls are conducted. And a lot of these polls that have come out recently, ABC, CNN, have been called into question because, by the way, they've also been heavily weighted toward Republicans. So before I say what I'm about to say, okay, well, some of you still have landlines. Okay, good for you. You can continue having them. I'm not going to say don't have a landline, but I'm just going to point out that it's very, very rare in this day and age that people have landlines going into their houses. One of the things that I was asked about on the Patreon feed this morning was the fact that Biden's approval ratings have apparently tanked in the polls 11 percentage points since the Hamas terrorist attack and Israel's the IDF's response in Gaza. Again, single polls do not make up election results. All right. So I have to point that out first and foremost. I have also spoken here about the fact that there are some significant influencers who have said that they're not voting for Biden anymore. And there was reporting this weekend in the New York Times that Muslims and the Arab community generally is really upset about the Biden administration's response to Israel's mass bombing of Gazan civilians. I'm really upset, frankly, about the IDF's bombing of Gazan civilians. I think anybody who's like humane understands that, like, the mass carpet bombing of, a tiny piece of land home to 2.2 million people, 50% of whom are children, is not humanitarian. Like, this is the understatement of the year. It's actually a war crime. And we've talked about this a lot on this broadcast also. All right. And I have to point out that we do not yet know how this is all going to play out in 2024. And I know there's a lot of concern about it right now. I also have to reiterate that, I think everybody understands that, not voting for Biden for re-election creates fascism in America for a future, into the future, for as long as like one can imagine, right? Because they're not going to give up power if they get it again. So we've got a lot to do. I keep saying this on every broadcast between now and the 2024 election. And also, I don't want people to panic, all right? Because I do also just want to point out that we know that in every communication that Biden is having right now with Netanyahu, he's saying, like, you've got to allow for more humanitarian solutions. Like, he spoke to him over the weekend, go read the readout, right? Like, it's not like the Biden administration isn't saying you've got to actually, like, do this in a humanitarian way. Now, is he going far enough on that? In my opinion, no. But, is that going to make me not vote for Joe Biden in 24? No. And, that's not because I think Joe Biden is endorsing genocide. I think it's because you have to actually, like, vote for politicians who are the most aligned with your interests and then push them to do better. So, that's really where I am on it. And I don't want anybody to be panicked about it. All right. Because I'm also just going to point out that, you can oppose genocide and you can oppose war crimes against civilians and against children. Okay. You can oppose what the IDF is doing in the Gaza Strip and still understand that not voting for Joe Biden is going to bring fascism home to America again. All right. So I think that we need a little bit more of, and again, this is why I keep saying to everybody, you have to have a nuanced understanding of what's happening. You have to educate yourself about what's happening. You also have to have a 30,000 foot view. And one of the things that's, like, incredibly dangerous about where we sit right now in relation to this is that there's very much this mentality of, like, you're either with us or you're against us, which is, again, as I pointed out last week, what led us after 9/11 to killing 300,000 Iraqi citizens. Okay. Like, that is not a solution to anything. We have to have, like, a very nuanced understanding of what's happening. And that includes, by the way, in our domestic politics and the domestic response. So it's really critical to kind of view it through, again, a nuanced and detailed lens. I'm also just going to point out that there was a very good piece this morning in the New York Times, which I encourage everyone to read, about how Netanyahu completely dropped the ball on the looming Hamas attack. And it is very detailed. I encourage you to take your time with this. Okay. But it is very clear that Netanyahu's policies, his domestic policies in Israel, led to a failure of intelligence that could have prevented what Hamas did on October 7th. And so, again, I really want to encourage you to read that. It's really important for those of us who have not been enmeshed in the political circumstances involving Palestine and Gaza to go educate ourselves before forming opinions. And the reporting on this morning in particular is very detailed. All right. Final point for today. Okay. I know that a lot of you are really overwhelmed. Wow, we've been going for 50 minutes. This is a really long broadcast. I know that a lot of you are really overwhelmed, and I know that many of you with marginalized identities, whatever those identities may be, and however intersectional they may be, are feeling very much under threat right now. Okay, I have that in my own house. I get it. Okay, I have to remind all of you that we have to be there for one another in moments like this, right? We have to show up for our friends. We have to show up for each other. We also have to show up for ourselves. And again, I'm hearing from more and more people in this community on Patreon and otherwise that, you're really struggling with your usual habits of self-regulation right now, not doing the trick. All right. So again, I have to remind you, you don't have to doom scroll. You don't have to tune into the news. The news is going to be there if you need to take a break for 24 or 48 hours or 72 hours. Like it's all going to be there for you to come back to. All right. I took 3 hours off on Saturday and went for a hike in the mountains here in California with my children. And it was awesome to not look at my phone that entire time, except to take some really great pictures of them. Right. It was really important for us as a family to get away from screens and out into nature and away from like other people fundamentally, and just enjoy like a really beautiful day in a really beautiful location. Again, I really want people to kind of like give yourselves permission, if you are feeling overwhelmed, to do whatever you need to do to take a break. Okay. And, the broadcast is going to be here. You can come back and watch broadcast like 3 days later. You're not going to miss anything. And it's way more important at this moment to prioritize your own sense of safety and security, to prioritize yourself, your nervous system regulation, right? And to make sure you're taking care of yourself and your people. All right. Just like so critically important. All right. Because I'll tell you something else. Like I am seeing kind of panic in some people that are friends of mine, that is a clear result of intergenerational trauma. All right. And it's scary to watch. All right. It's scary to watch my friends who are descendants of Holocaust survivors talking about creating safe rooms in their own homes. And even if they're living somewhere where the likelihood of something like that is maybe a little bit greater than it was a month ago, but not looming, right? And again, I'm not diminishing anti-Semitic violence, Islamophobic violence. I'm not diminishing any of this, all right? But I'm also seeing people like, because they're not disengaging and taking care of themselves when they need to, reaching a level of trauma response that is really, really, really not healthy. And I want people to do what they need to do to take care of their mental health and their physical health right now, to as much as humanly possible. It's just like really, really key. Okay. I love you guys. You're awesome. This community is rad. You're like really, really good people. I, again, want to remind you, if you have not yet subscribed, or actually just hit the like button and subscribe here, because that's free, but you can also head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive and become a paid subscriber. Our universe of people over there, by the way, is like beautiful and lovely and full of wonderful folks. And, I just want to encourage you to kind of be in community with people who are like-minded and working to make the world a better place right now, because it also will help you manage the stress of what we're all living through. Okay. It's going to be a crazy week, everybody. Everybody knows that. Lots of testimony, lots of stuff going on in Colorado. New York State fraud case is going to be absolutely bonkers between now and next Wednesday, Thursday of next week, with like Don Jr., Eric, Ivanka, and Trump himself testifying. So stay tuned, because I'll be here covering all of it. And I really want everyone to just take very, very good care of yourselves. All right. I will see you all soon. All right. I'll see you here tomorrow, no matter what. And there will always be an emergency broadcast if necessary. All right. Take care, everyone. Much love. And I'll see you here tomorrow at the latest. Bye.